I just want to give some background context into our discussion here today. Theo and I have been working on a research on understanding how any consumer brand can evolve into a platform. When I first started my work in platforms, one of my key issues was in making people understand that this was not just an Uber, Airbnb thing. It was a structural shift in business models that was happening across the economy. And so to explain that, I came up with the metaphor of the pipeline, that traditional business models, industrial business models worked in a pipeline model. And when you think of pipelines versus platforms, one of the most interesting things that comes to mind is the fact that there's a shift in scarcity when you move from the pipeline model to the platform model. The pipeline model is built on the assumption that distribution is scarce. And so if you want to have competitive advantage, you want to own distribution. The platform model, to a large extent, is built on the assumption that ecosystem attention is scarce. And so if you want to have competitive advantage over there, you need to ensure that you have control over the ecosystem. And we've seen that play out in media, where traditional media used to hold control over distribution. And the emerging media players, the ones who are really making money, Google and Facebook, are making money because of an ecosystem model. And so this shift from scarcity in distribution to scarcity in attention is something that Theo started seeing happening in the consumer goods industry as well. And what happens when you move from a pipeline to a platform model is that your focus as a company moves away from push the product to pull the ecosystem. And that's what happened in media. That's something that Theo saw an opportunity for in consumer goods as well. And the other big issue, the other big difference that happens between pipelines and platforms is that pipelines rely heavily on supply-side economy to scale, and platforms have the opportunity to rely on demand-side economy to scale that scale often at much lower marginal costs of expansion as well. And so these are issues that Theo had been looking at and saw opportunities in consumer goods industries moving in this direction as well. Around that time, he read my first book, Platform Scale, and realized that there was a nexus, an intersection between what was happening in the world of platforms and what could be possible in the world of consumer brands. And that's how we connected, and since then have been collaborating on this research. Thank you for joining me, Theo. I'd like to start by asking you about your motivations of getting into this. You've been talking to CMOs around the world, and what did you start seeing in the market that made you believe that there's an opportunity for every brand to become a platform?
Yeah, there was, well, thanks, Sangeet, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. There is, I would say, two motivations. One is a personal motivation. I've been, like, all my life working for major consumer goods companies, and I was intrigued by the emergence of digital and several discussions about, the new platform business like Facebook, Google, and how, I would say, companies that have such, I would say, equity in their brands, like Coca-Cola, like Nike, like Oreo, how they can leverage the power of platforms to become like not like a follower, but maybe a leader in digital space. So that was my personal question was how they can go from being leaders in physical world to be leaders also in digital world as well. That was, I would say, that intrigued me since the beginning. But at the same time, 1 year ago, I started to see a lot of demand coming from clients that they were demanding, I would say, a proper, more structured advice in terms of how to invest in marketing. I would say for years, consumer good companies have been investing in global systems, shared services in low-cost countries, or tax-efficient supply chain, really capturing supply-side economies of scale. The question is, how do they take advantage of the demand-side economy of scale? The second thing is that for consumer goods industry in particular, the emergence of wearables and wearables really changed the game. The question was, how can I do more without just thinking about an intelligent vending machine? And actually, I would say the consumer good companies that have given the privilege to the retailers to connect with the end consumer. Now they're able to connect and talk maybe live with the end consumer. So this really changed I would say, the dynamics in terms of marketing. where from you're sitting behind, I would say, a TV advertisement to basically being able to talk with the end consumer. And last is also the publication of several, I would say, academic work around platform economics, which basically brought, I think, that the robustness of the thinking behind it, that, well, this is not a startup thing. This might be something that we can take advantage as, I would say, as an industry. So these things, I would say, created that, well, let's try to investigate. If we can use the platform thinking, platforms, building platforms, to the, I would say, brands that are successful in the physical world.
So when you take it back to the CMO, what are the key challenges that they're facing today that you believe that brand as a platform or the concept that we've been working on is that's going to address those challenges?
Yeah, it's talking to CMOs about this. There are, I think, three things that I would say, three preoccupations. One is digital services innovation. Consumer good companies, as a pipe business, they have been, I would say, master in doing physical product innovation. They never thought about doing services, digital services innovation. Well, to be present in digital space, you need to do some sort of digital services. You need to expand the proposition of your product in terms of to engage with your consumer in digital space. So the first one is digital innovation. How do I do that? How do I do that at the pace of what we call the fluid consumer is demanding? The second one is brand visibility. In digital, Dove competes with Angry Birds. I heard recently statistics about Facebook user on average spends 46 minutes on Facebook per day. A couple weeks ago, I heard from the CEO of Alibaba saying that the average, we say, Alibaba consumer spends 20 minutes per day in Alibaba killing time. I'm not talking about making a transaction, just killing time. I mean, imagine these statistics when you think about the brand manager of a brand called like Dove or Oreo. I mean, this would be their dream, right? So how to make this a reality? How to make this, especially for a gaming like Angry Birds, to make you revisiting the brand in digital space, to have touch points that goes beyond just when I buy the product, when I'm consuming the product. And the third was really engagement. How do we ensure to have engagement in digital space? So these three, I would say, innovation, visibility, and engagement were the three top, I would say, preoccupations when we talk about, I would say, going to digital for these CPG brands.
Got it. So let's talk about brand as a platform, as a concept. So when I talked about this at the beginning, when we move from pipelines to platforms, we're talking about a shift from push the product to pull the ecosystem in terms of how companies think about it. And even if you look at media has gone from pushing content to, if you look at Facebook, pulling an ecosystem of content providers. And so when we think of brand as a platform, today's consumer brands have been very focused on pushing products. Whereas when they move to pulling the ecosystem, how does that work? You also talk about experience brands versus utility brands. How does brand as a platform work differently across these two kinds of categories? Yeah,
when we started to do this study, we have like a couple observations. From a consumer standpoint, we have, despite we, as a consumer, we know maybe 1,000 brands, or we heard and we know what these brands do. We actually have a very limited set of brands that makes part of our day-to-day life. And it's the number ranges between 100 and 150. If you have more than that, probably you don't have a meaningful relationship with those brands. Maybe you have one bank, you have one car brand, you have like one telco, but you have probably a lot of grocery brands, a lot of personal care brands, a lot of sports, a lot of fashion brands. But the number is irrelevant. The point is that when you start to populate this space with digital brands, you're probably dropping some other brands that you're not visible to you anymore because you're spending more time in Facebook, in Alibaba, or apps like that. So the message for brand managers is that you cannot just kind of think to go to digital to create an app. And sometimes I go to a meeting with my clients, and I usually go to the Apple Store and try to see how many apps they have created just to create an engagement. Well, I think that an app about bottled water is not going to fly. Probably I will download and probably will never use and will delete from my iPhone. So the space that we have is quite limited. You need to be very precise. The other observation is that the way we interact with these brands in digital is different, is materially different. Let me give an example just to try to illustrate and we created this concept of utility brands and experience brands. So I do my grocery in Waitrose. I live in the Little Rock, so it's a UK retailer. So I do my grocery it's my brand for doing grocery. And every 2 weeks, I go online and I look at, I would say, my past order. I try to adjust, a couple items, and I press the send button. 2 days after, the goods are delivered to my doorstep. Well, what I have in that shopping basket are the items that I don't want to think about it. I don't want to run out of them. And I want to spend maybe 20 minutes per week on a Monday evening or Tuesday evening. I don't want to spend a weekend because it's too precious for me to spend doing this kind of a purchase. I was wondering why Waitrose never called me and said, well, we have looked at your pattern of purchase, and you have been consuming every 2 weeks the similar, I would say, order. Would you like to subscribe and we can deliver this average order every 2 weeks? I would say, yes, absolutely. Well, it's very easy to think that, well, this is not rocket science, and this can happen, tomorrow if Waitrose call me. But the implications of that is that maybe in the future, we'll see some of the brands that are part of this, I would say, shopping basket, they will be embedded in objects. Today, we see that the Amazon dash button. Well, I press the dash button. Well, it's not very long that the machine will press the dash button itself. So these brands that we call utility brands, they are, I would say, they will be in the future in the connected home. In my washing machine, reordering washing powder. In my fridge, reordering juice. So the kind of relationship that I have with these brands are really, I would say, I don't want to think about it. And if it can have like a magic autopilot, I want to take this outside of my view, like I can spend on other brands. However, there are other brands that I like to spend more time. I like Nespresso. I like espresso, and I think Nespresso gives me a full espresso experience. I like that not only because I like to drink espresso, but I like because of the new flavors. I like to share with my friends. I like to offer to my family. And I have a whole experience. I like to see what is the origin, where it comes from, this new coffee. So there is an experience. I like to go to the boutique during the weekend. I do some fashion brands, the same kind of experience. It's quite different. The way for consumer good brands, the way in digital, I will relate to these two brands. Roughly speaking, I would say for my space of brands, maybe 80% of my brands will be utility brands, 20% will be experience brands. And this needs to be, I would say, considered when a product manager that Oreo or any brand for consumer goods needs to think through that not every, I would say, brand will have the capacity to engage in a very similar way. You need to be precise. You need to think through how these two kind of brands will relate to the consumer so you can develop, I would say, a proper channel for communication and engagement.
Right, yeah. That sounds great. So if you think of the distinction between utility and experience brands, and if we think of an ecosystem, you're really saying that a utility brand is something where the usage of the product itself is delivering the main value. Mm-hmm. And so when you bring in a whole suite of connected products, there's just much more value through the network effect of these connected products. Whereas an experience brand is one where the value that the user gets is beyond just the usage of the product. And that's in the entire experience. And over there, you can bring in a whole ecosystem of third-party service providers, adjacent products, all of which could together create that holistic experience. So I like the distinction of how it works differently for these two kinds of brand families, if you will. How does this change the role of, or the job of the brand manager? You talk about the brand manager traditionally having been more of a person who was controlling the perception of the brand in the pipeline, whereas now he's sort of curating an ecosystem around the brand. So what does it mean for the brand manager to be a curator, and how does that change his role from what he does today?
Yeah, well, I think it changed dramatically, especially because I would say a lot of those product managers will need to live in a hybrid, I would say, world, where a portion of the, I would say, their connectivity with the consumer will be via, I would say, digital, but there's still a big part of the business where they will be acting as a pipe business. But I would say for digital, it changed dramatically. If you think that, for a pipe business, the battlefield is the shelf display, and that every time that we go to a store and we make a choice between brand A or brand B, and we see a different price, we see a different packaging, we see something happening like a trial on store, a merchandiser, a coupon or something that makes me change, I would say, the brand at that specific moment. When you look for digital, this completely, several of those levers goes away. To give a very simple example, if a product, I would say, manager can change formulation twice a year, so you can innovate twice a year to change a formulation, put a new scent in a shampoo or a new flavor, different variation of a flavor. So, and you can have 3 to 4 package changes during the year to keep bringing something new to the consumer. In digital, packaging changes are almost, I would say, negligible, the impact that this can have in terms of the consumer purchase. So you have to rethink about what are the levers that a brand manager will have in terms of in digital. Just think about my Waitrose example. If I have a subscription, or let's think about if my washing machine is reordering washing powder every couple weeks when I run out of washing powder, before I run out of washing powder, how a brand manager will be able to affect my decision to change brands? Well, I need to get to the washing machine, open it and try to reset the algorithm that's ordering that specific brand that I like. So it's very unlikely that this will happen. In this context, I think that the brand manager needs to start thinking about how he can be a curator of, I would say, an ecosystem that includes the washing, the appliance, I would say, company, that includes, I would say, the connected kitchen, that I can interact and make my brand visible and leverage the ecosystem and not myself, just the product itself. So I think that it changed significantly. I used to say that, well, social listening is the new customer panel. Digital assets is the new shelf display. Content is the new advertisement. So in this part of the world that's growing quite rapidly, you need to change, you need to review your practices, your marketing practices.
It's a scary thought, right? Because brand managers are sort of control freaks because they don't want the brand to be diluted. And now you're talking about giving up control, curating an ecosystem, bringing in others who might have an impact on the brand. And I like the fact that you point out content is the new advertising, and that's how brand managers need to think about it. Because this is where media companies are finding it difficult when a brand like Marriott has a 100-member content team today. They're becoming a media company from having been just a hotel brand. So that's something that we're seeing happen in different verticals increasingly. So let's make this a bit specific with a few use cases, a few case studies. If you think about consumer goods, we're talking about a whole range of verticals, from food to baby care to beauty to consumer electronics. And there are some verticals that are inherently utility, right? Your consumer electronics, home appliances, very utility focused. Some like beauty, for example, are beauty and grooming are very experience. And there might be some like detergents, for example, where some brands might be utility and some might be experience, if you will. So if you think of these different verticals, are there certain verticals where you see this shift more likely to happen in the near future? And are there any case studies that you can share of shifts that have already happened?
Yeah, I think that there is, I would say, maybe it's hard to generalize at this stage.
Sure.
But for sure, I would say some categories, I would say, will have like a more experience, like fashion, for instance. It has like a much more like an experience angle on that. Let me ask a question just to try to illustrate what I'm saying. If I say the word Nike, the brand Nike, what is the first word that comes to your mind?
Fitness, athleticism.
So I would say 90% of the people that I ask this question respond that way, with an experience rather than the product. 10% responds tennis shoes. So every time that you have a brand essence that goes beyond just the product, you have the capacity to create, I would say, an experienced brand platform. And I would say some categories are, I would say, categories that are more, I would say, adapt to that. You can think about, ice cream, but well, in ice cream you have Magnum, which is a differentiated ice cream. You have maybe, I would say, Nespresso in coffee, which is a differentiated as well. A couple of things are important on experienced brand platforms. One is social. Social interactivity is absolutely key. The second one is richness of the ecosystem. So you have to have other partners adding value to that ecosystem. On the opposite side, if we think about utility brands, I would say a couple of things that are different are also critical. One is availability. Imagine if my, I would say, washing machine is reordering something that is, I would say, out of stock in Waitrose, out of stock in Amazon. Well, then I have a disruption. The second one is connected devices. And the third one is subscription. Subscription is, well, Dollar Shave Club all showed us that, buying razor blades by subscription is a good thing to do. So I think that, the elements that we need to enforce on each of those, I would say, extremes are quite different.
Thanks to you. So as that's a lot of food for thought. So as we think about this in terms of how it applies to our different companies, how it applies to the brands that we work with, there's an opportunity for us to think about moving from push the product, own the brand, control the brand, to pull an ecosystem, curate the ecosystem, and own the consumer attention from there. Thank you so much for joining me, Tio, and I'd like to open this up for questions at this point.
I have a question. I was wondering if you, or if you know of anybody who does know, about how, here, I wrote it down so that I wouldn't mess it up. So I was wondering if consumer behavior decision heuristics have been changing since digital platforms have become a bigger and bigger factor in our purchasing habits. And second, if you know if any research being done on whether that's just like a nature versus nurture thing, like are our brains being rewired for the decision-making process?
Yeah, well, I've heard some work being done on that area. I think that what the richness that we have today in terms of not only the academic work being done, but also from a practical perspective, say the richness of the data, structured and unstructured data, behavior data, the way, how many runs I do in my washing machine, this kind of a data gives back to the product manager the capacity to understand deeper, obviously, the consumer behavior. I've seen some work. It's still emerging area. So I would say I cannot point to a specific case that would say, well, these guys are doing very well on that. Because the whole thing is very emerging for consumer goods, which are maybe followers in this regard. I think that they are trying to catch up.
I think if I were to just add to that, there are especially two aspects in which there's a lot of opportunity for brand managers. One is that because of platforms, you can fundamentally change the decision flow and you create new decision support systems. Mm-hmm. So in the past, you'd ask somebody where to stay, and now you go to TripAdvisor. The other, again, taking from an example from the travel industry, is that you don't just provide new decision support systems, you can actually design new behaviors. So in the past, you wouldn't go and stay at a random stranger's house in some part of the world, and today you do. It's called Airbnb. And so if you look at these two elements, decision support towards behavior and actual behavior, both things are being transformed because of data, because of interactivity, and I think that's one of the things that makes the brand as a platform idea extremely powerful, because if you're a platform, you have to acquire data, and if you acquire data, you can, I don't want to use that word, but you can manipulate consumer behavior all through the journey.
My question would be about market research. How does it change now with the onset of platforms in a company, in a brand, when now they are studying the customer behavior, and now with the change to ecosystem and interaction, what set of tools do they have? It is something new. How do they direct then the decisions of the CEOs and marketing?
I think it changed a lot. I would say the key challenge for consumer good companies is that despite some of the brands that I mentioned, they have millions of consumers that are loyal to their brands. The brands don't know who they are, where they are, what they do, what is their pattern of purchase. So data is a very important challenge. On the same conversation with the Alibaba CEO, he was showing a case where I would say Alibaba was basically providing information for consumer packaged goods, where traditionally, I would say consumer packaged goods take 18 weeks to do a consumer panel and basically feed into R&D to develop new products. Alibaba was able to provide the same level of granular information in 1 week because the richness of their ecosystem. So I think that the data richness of the platforms, and I think that what's going to distinguish, I would say, winners and losers in consumer goods in the future will be the capacity to aggregate data and make sense of that in terms of leveraging, I would say, the platform use. I think it will change dramatically in the future.
Yeah, I think if I were to just add to that, you know, the most obvious part of how market research is changing is latency, right? Because earlier market research would happen and it would take some time before things came back, and now things are just, that latency is going away. It's just much more interactive. So we understand that shift from focus groups to lean startup and all of that. But I think going forward, the other part that is increasingly becoming very interesting is that machine learning can change market research. Because over time, you can actually train machines to understand how to predict market behavior based on other sets that they've looked at in the past. And I think that's where things are very powerful, where the cost of market research can go down even further, and it can become even more scalable, especially for multinationals to use market research.